the physical exam that you spent some time describing and the little test where you just shoot it 12 times in the lab into the water or whatnot. That doesn't answer that question, does it?
Which question is that exactly?
The question of whether the gun is able to fire without pressing the trigger.
Right. Again, I can only tell you about the results of my testing. So initially it functioned normally, and then the accidental discharge testing, beyond that.
Sure, but you wouldn't have suggested and ultimately performed a test that led to the destruction of the firearm if the physical exam and the functional 12 shots into the water were sufficient to answer that.
Now I wish I'd started a destruction counter.
Question, would you have?
That's a question that's up to the case agent. So I can provide them the information. I could tell them we have the capability to do this examination, but they're the ones that need to make that determination.
The risks of malfunction, I take it that this expression, you're talking about manufacturing defects, modifications of the weapon, or any other damage that could have occurred inside the weapon because of an accident or a drop. Is that what you mean when you say malfunction?
Oh, it could be a variety of things. It could be age. It could be the firearm hasn't been taken care of, so it's rusted and corroded. It could have been laying in the bottom of a lake for the past year. So I know nothing about the history of this gun. So while I'm doing those initial inspections, I'm doing that initial test firing, when I speak about malfunctions, that's what I'm speaking of.
And so when you look at the gun from the outside, you can't always identify if the gun has something wrong with it, can you?
Not visually, no.
Right. And neither could a random actor on a movie set, right? They would have no way to know by looking at a gun, right?
So,
that you're aware of?
objection, speculation.
Yeah.
Can anyone?
Want to rephrase it? Okay, thank you.
Is it possible to know just by physically looking at a gun whether or not it's capable of malfunctioning?
I would say no.
And even if you've test fired in your laboratory in a little water bucket a bunch of times in that sort of stabilized environment, just because that works and there's not a catastrophic explosion of the gun or something like that, that doesn't mean that it's impossible if there's a malfunction, does it?
That's correct. I can only tell you that it functioned normally during my testing.
And you did.
Can you see the defense reaching? That doesn't mean it's not possible, right? And space aliens could exist. There's just no evidence to support this theory that the gun just malfunctioned.
And at that point, before you went into the accidental testing that led to the destruction of the firearm, you didn't disassemble and look at the inside of the gun, did you?
No, at that point, there was no reason for me to do so.
Well, nobody asked you to.
That's correct, but I also did not see anything that would give me cause to do so.
And not only did you not disassemble it, but you obviously didn't disassemble it and take photographs or video of the inside, true?
Prior to the accidental discharge testing?
Right.
That's correct. I did not do that.
And you have disassembled very similar single action revolvers in your career, have you not?
Yes.
You didn't videotape any of the testing that you have discussed here today, correct?
That's correct. We did not videotape our examinations.
Nor did anybody ask you to videotape your examination, true?
Not in this case.
And I take it the way that you're able to recount what you're telling this court is because you took notes and you have worksheets that wrote down what you did and when you did it. Is that fair?
As well as the standard operating procedures, but yes, you are correct.
Well, but there's different points in this case where you weren't sure whether you did the function test and then sought permission from the state's prosecutors to hit the gun with the mallet, or whether you waited to do all of the testing until you got permission. Isn't that fair that you're not sure about the order of this?
No, I disagree with that.
Okay, you're quite confident that you did the visual and functional test before asking for permission before they asked you to do the accidental discharge test. Is that your testimony?
I see your question. No, I can't tell you exactly when I did the function test, if that was before or after that conversation. However, it was before the accidental discharge test.
Right. So I just want to make sure that you are correct. That's what I was getting at. I just want to make sure, that's clear to the court that despite your worksheets and the best of your memory, you don't actually know at what point you asked, or rather they asked you to perform the accidental discharge test. True?
I do have messages in my comm log for the dates that I had those conversations.
Right, but as you just testified to about a minute ago, you don't know the order of what occurred when, as you sit here, do you?
You specifically asked me if I knew if I function tested it prior to that conversation. So my answer to that is no, but I do know the order that I conducted the examinations in.
Sure, I know that you conducted the functional test prior to the accidental discharge test, because after the accidental discharge test, the gun wouldn't function. Fair?
True.
Now, and the way you do keep track of this, even though you don't obviously know the exact order compared to the phone call with the prosecutors and the detective or any law enforcement interaction you had, is you take notes as you're doing this. Is that fair?
That's correct.
Okay. And you take in the thousands of exams that you've done. You're a note taker. Fair?
You're a note
I'm not quite sure how to
taker.
answer that. We have standardized note sheets that have mandatory fields that I have to populate.
And in all of those examinations, the thousands you've done, the almost decade you've had at the lab, have you ever performed this test on a firearm?
In a actual case,
In an actual case?
this is the first time. First and only.
First and only. And the firearm cannot be tested now in the condition that it came to you in. Fair?
Not in the condition that as a result of my testing. That's true.
And it's not just you've also said, by the way, that this examination
This is the same argument they would have made if the FBI guy had dismantled the gun to examine the internal components first and then tested it. They would have said, well, you can't test it now as it was in its original condition, right? Because you took it apart and put it back together again. It's not in the same condition.
report were fairly complex. Is that fair?
I'm not sure where you're getting that from.
Well, I'm asking you. We can refresh your memory, but I'm asking you, was the examination report here fairly complex?
You wouldn't see the word complex anywhere in my report.
Not in your report, but what about in an email transmitting your report? Saying that this, sorry for the delays with the report, this was fairly complex.
I would have to see that message.
Okay. Do you dispute that the examination and the report were fairly complex?
I'm not sure what you're referring to because that could be speaking to the entirety of the evidence in the case, which was almost 200 items. So yes, I would agree that is a complex case.
The information we've discussed so far, you mentioned on direct examination that there's a manual that comes with this firearm, right?
That's correct.
And this concept,
I have to say, when this guy testified in the Hannah Gutierrez case, I thought he came across as a bit of a dummy in this testimony. He's doing much better here.
of the firearm going off without pressing the trigger is something that's actually discussed in the manual of the firearm. True?
As far as I'm aware, that circumstance is only in that manual with the hammer in one particular setting.
Sure. Thank you for that clarification. But it is true that the manual discusses that this firearm can go off without pulling the trigger. True.
Specifically with the hammer at rest, you are correct.
And you've said this isn't some phenomenon. This is something that's known about the design of these firearms. True?
With the hammer at rest, you are correct.
And well, in the owner's manual also says that a blow to the hammer resulting from a fall dropping of the gun can also cause the gun to discharge. True?
With the hammer at rest, you're correct.
Okay.
None of which happened in this case. I mean, on the one hand, the defense gets upset. Why did you destroy the gun with this destructive testing that destroyed the gun when the facts don't require an impact test? No one is claiming the gun was impacted. And then they flip the script and they say, but isn't it true that if this gun were impacted, it could discharge without the trigger being pulled?
Or if the hammer slips from the shooter's thumb, right?
I would have to see that line to see what that is referring to.
The manual also says that the person should not even touch the trigger because
Right, this is objectionable. I'm surprised the state is not objecting because this is the lawyer testifying. Now, this is not in front of a jury. The judge is giving them a lot of latitude, and this guy's burning a lot of time. This whole day was supposed to wrap up in less than an hour, and there are only 2 witnesses in here. And they started an hour earlier than they were scheduled to start. I think the judge is going to start getting exasperated
of this concern and sensitivity of the hammer falling. True?
I would attribute that to general firearm safety.
But it's in this manual. True?
I don't specifically know that.
Objection calls for speculation. And if he's referring to the manual, I'd ask that he give Mr. Ziegler an opportunity to review the manual.
I'm not required to do that in a cross-examination. He said he reviewed the manual. I'm asking if he knows that.
What was the question that she's saying is speculation?
I guess that I just asked him, does the manual say that don't even touch the trigger because the hammer can slip in this firearm? Does the manual say that? Do you know that?
May I answer?
Yes, but you're assuming that he remembers. So
If he doesn't remember, I understand that he may not
All right.
remember it. It's in his report and it's in the manual. So I'm just asking.
All right. Thank you.
I do not know the answer to that.
If the trigger is held in, okay, while you're cocking it, and the hammer falls, that can set off this firearm. Isn't that true?
Depending on how far the hammer is cocked, because you have to keep in mind as you're cocking the hammer, the cylinder starts to rotate. So again, depending on the position of the cylinder, if the hammer falls and does not make contact with the primer, it won't fire. However, you are correct. If I hold the trigger in and I cock the hammer and I let it go, you may fire a cartridge in that method.
And the manual says, and you know from your own experience, that you shouldn't load every single chamber on one of these revolvers because it's at risk. Fair?
And that is referring to the hammer being at rest on a loaded chamber. Yes.
Now, I understand you keep saying that, Mr. Ziegler. Were you prepped on that point before you testified here today?
Objection, Your Honor. Argumentative.
I'm allowed to ask a witness what their preparation was on a topic. Were you prepped on that topic before today, Mr. Ziegler?
No, sir. I keep reiterating that because you appear to be insinuating that this firearm can fire with the hammer in every position, and you're using direct quotes from the owner's manual when those quotes refer to a specific hammer setting.
So you weren't, well, I'm asking you a different question now, which is, were you prepped on the issue of whether or not this gun could fire without pulling the trigger before today?
He
We
said
certainly
no.
had trial prep.
Mechanism that we're describing, which you obviously can describe more artfully than me, is not the same on every modern firearm. Not every modern firearm can go off like what we're describing, true?
That is correct.
And there's actually examples of firearms similar to this firearm, right? And you've said you've disassembled very similar single action revolvers before, that if the sear was defective, the gun could accidentally discharge, true?
That depends on many factors.
Sure. I'm just simply asking you, is it possible that if a sear is defective on one of these firearms, it could accidentally discharge? Is that possible?
It is possible, but there are also safety mechanisms within the firearm, to include this firearm, that would prevent that from happening.
And I'm assuming that there's a caveat on all of these answers, but I'm asking just simply, assuming all other caveats, is it possible that, for example, that if the main spring on this firearm was loose, or there's a loose screw, it could accidentally discharge?
I don't agree with the example you just used.
What about if the notches are worn?
That is a possibility.
And we talked about, or you talked, I guess, on direct about the trigger pull. And just to make sure it's clear, at least in my mind in the courts, the trigger and the hammer, they interlock so that if one is moving, it has an impact on the other. Is that fair to say?
That's correct. The hammer has notches, and the trigger sits within those notches. So as the hammer is being cocked, the trigger is moving within those notches.
Okay. And you would agree that the trigger weight on this firearm was on the low end of the range of trigger pulls. Fair?
Amongst all firearms?
Amongst all firearms, amongst all single action revolvers, whatever denominator you want to use.
As I testified previously, that I feel this range is in line with this type of firearm. Now, if you compare that to a double action firearm or some completely different firearm, then sure, it is lower than what other firearms.
Yeah. So he said what, 2 pounds, 2 to 2.5 pounds. I don't think that's exceptionally light for a single action revolver. Which have exceptionally light trigger pulls. For other types of revolvers, I mean, I have a very nice 1911 single action semi-automatic that you carry with the hammer cocked and the safety on. That's got about a 3.5 trigger for a carry gun. That's about as light as I would be inclined to go. But keep in mind, you have the luxury of a very light trigger on a single action revolver because you have to cock the hammer all the way before the gun can fire, before the trigger is active, can discharge the gun. So until you cock the hammer on a single action, the trigger doesn't do anything. It has an infinite trigger weight. And once you've cocked the hammer, you know the trigger's light. That's when you're preparing to shoot the gun. You're not walking around with the hammer cocked.